Black American culture and fashion are dominating quite a lot right now, not just across the US, but across the world. Africa, Europe, Asia, across countries like Nigeria, Ghana, the UK, Germany, France, Korea. You can't deny the influence of African American culture on fashion across the globe. But it hasn't always been this way, and the culture has grown, changed, adapted and thrived in so many ways since the emancipation 160 years ago. The wildest thing though is how much of this journey is still very much slept on, and just how many people don't realize that fashion and culture now, and how many people don't realize how much fashion and culture now has influences from parts across this journey. The fact that the Grammys decided to split the Best Country Album award into two after Beyonce won it just shows how in denial America still is about black people's greatness. But despite over a century of this, black American people have been doing the fashion game up for time. And we're going to explore some of the biggest movements over the last 100 years. Let's talk about it. The Emancipation Proclamation happened in 1865, and suddenly slavery was over. Generations of torture and servitude ended, and African American people felt closer to a better future, where they were treated equally. But obviously, as we know, the reality was far from this. The white people of the South made sure to put every barrier in place that they could think of. Jim Crow laws came in, segregating essentially everything: travel, work, academia, and pushing black people down to second-class citizens, who lived every day with the very real threat of lynchings by KKK members and legions of other white racists desperate to bring slavery back. While black people were free in the US, they were just thrown into another giant difficulty, where they were lesser in the eyes of the country that they lived in, were born in, and worked to build. The worst part was the country they'd helped build, it was thriving. Towards the end of the 19th century, the United States was starting to cement itself as a global superpower. Moving into the 20th century, they were the biggest global economy, and they'd freshly just seized a big chunk of the Spanish Empire, effectively ending the latter in the process. It was marching its way up to top the charts in terms of global power, alongside the likes of Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan and more. On the outside, this made the country look amazing, and for many, it was. However, the growth in industrial power spawned many more companies, which needed more labour, which resulted in them not just bringing in more people from across the world, but also just paying people pennies to maximise their profits. It was hard enough for many working class white workers, especially those who were immigrants, as whiteness itself was really massively separated. But imagine being black too. News of booming new factories and businesses towards the north of the US offering a ton of jobs spread quickly amongst the South. With this reputation being, well, less racist, it seemed like a brighter future lay ahead for African American people there. So across they travelled, and so began what's now known as the Great Migration. Fast forward to the 20th century, and hundreds of thousands of African American people have migrated to places like Detroit, Chicago and LA. But there's one neighborhood where they're about to make history. Harlem. Chapter 1. The Harlem Renaissance. The Great Harlem Migration had seen almost 200,000 African American people migrate from the racist South up to Harlem specifically, which made the neighborhood have the largest concentration of black people across the globe. It drew a vast array of African American people, from laborers to poets to musicians, all unified by one goal: to escape the racist South and create better lives for themselves. Post-World War I, the neighborhood was also attracting African American former soldiers, who were disenfranchised by how the country was treating them. They had risked their lives in a war in a country that they'd basically been forced to be a part of, and now they came back to it to receive no credit or respect for what they'd just been through. One insult to fight so hard, then come back to see a countrywide narrative that black people are lazy, stupid, and useless. The full toxicity of this racism then served as ample fuel for what was to come, where prose, plays, and music were to beautifully capture the thoughts, feelings, and experiences of the African American populace in a way like never before. Writer Langston Hughes put it best: gave them the courage to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. Finally, not only were they able to be raw and true, but they were surrounded by others who would feel it and help it spread. Alongside the creative boom was a real social and economic push. Literacy rates for African American people shot up massively. National organizations like the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, were formed, committed to continue the fight for equal rights for African American people, and the Pan-African movement blossomed and became widespread. Pan-Africanism helped facilitate more interest in the mother continent of Africa, and an integration of values and self-love from across the continent in the African American way of life. But this would only be a part of it. African American people had long since yearned for their own identity. And as the Harlem Renaissance grew, not only did this sense of identity start to take shape, but also the question, how would this sense of identity be lived, shown, explored? Yes, it would be explored in the poems they wrote. Yes, it would be explored in the songs they sang. But there's something even more integral to them, something every African American person had a connection to, a need for. What do you think? You guessed it. Fashion. Not everyone could sing or write or even had a connection to any of them, but we all gotta wear clothes. We mostly all gotta wear clothes. Our beautiful coils will always grow from our head, for the most part. Just as the art and culture of the time was not only a rejection of the mainstream narrative, but a bold statement of African American people's identity, so too was the fashion. Men typically wore tailored suits with gorgeous patterns and vibrant colours. For African American women, the era was filled with an additional rejection of typical gender roles and the confines they put on their fashion. The flapper style dress became really popular, which was shorter than the dresses from before, and they embellished the looks with bold jewelry such as pearl necklaces and the finest fur coats. Don't you know, darling? They'd also sometimes wear belts at their waist to accentuate their hips and help create a more refined silhouette, highlighting the fact that they were now stepping out with up to 30% more leg on display. The creativity of the era was flowing abundantly through their clothes, and mixed wonderfully with women's evolution of how they were freeing themselves from the rigid gender box that they'd been historically slapped into. Look at this picture. Look at the gorgeous outfits they were wearing. Beautiful fur coats, keeping them warm, but open a little at the chest to show you their lovely neckwear. Look at this pic. Yes, you could see sis on the street and just think, what lovely hats. But look closer. Look at the shape. The hats that kept their heads warm, but also they were there to highlight their hair. The bob that would be bobbing, now they were cutting their hair shorter. See, fashion itself was changing, as there was a shift in how it was consumed, with the era of the model beginning, but also fashion itself was more of a public thing, rather than a private practice for the wealthy. And suddenly, black women and men were also seeing themselves represented more somewhat in the arts, with beauties like Josephine Baker, Gladys Bentley, Ethel Waters, and plenty of men leading the way in reframing the self-image through fashion. Fashion was becoming a point of aspiration for the average person more and more daily. But for a lot of African American people, it was also now a way to showcase the things you'd earned, the things you'd worked for and accrued. Discrimination in housing sales wouldn't be made illegal for another generation. And even without that, hierarchy on work and labor was set up. It was incredibly hard for African American people to build up the wealth that it would take to buy a home, so they could display their status, their finances, their accomplishments through their clothes. Because if you're out in the streets and seen with a gorgeous, freshly produced mink coat, where people would say, "Ooh, she got the money." If you're out with a perfectly tailored 3-piece zoot suit, matching fedora, and shoes freshly shined so well that they were more reflective than Charlemagne's head, people would see you and say, that is a sign of success. I want to that man. I want to be that man. You get me? And also, for being real, it wasn't just to other black people. The reality was statements of wealth and somewhat fashion integration would have an effect on how white people viewed them too. Sadly, as the Roaring Twenties ended, the Harlem Renaissance did too. The onset of the Great Depression plunged a big chunk of businesses into bankruptcy, obviously affecting black Americans more. And it meant that the arts were receiving less funding because, well, everybody was broke. But even though the Renaissance had lasted but a decade, the legacy it had left on the country was something that couldn't be denied. It had finally given African American people the voice they truly needed. They learned to see themselves as beautifully as they were, and it had stoked the embers and flames of resistance against the white supremacist images of soulless and lazy the country had to try to paint on them. But this was just the beginning. Chapter 2. Civil Rights Era. Integration versus rebellion. 4 decades after the advent of the Harlem Renaissance, life was still far from easy for African American people. Similarly to the end of World War I, World War II also saw the sacrifice and demoralization of many African American people. Over 1 million served across the US forces during the war, and suffered racism and segregation across their entire terms of service. Again, they returned to a thankless country, who happily erased and chose not to acknowledge the help they lent to the war effort. Meanwhile, the white veterans were hailed as heroes. The decade that would come after would be just as degrading. The war had forced America to go through growth, and after the end, the economy just kept booming. The economy itself had grown by 1/3 across the decade, creating a far better standard of living and improving the buying power of most Americans. More American families were now buying luxuries, holidays, cars, TVs, Hell, the latest fits were booming too. However, this didn't trickle down the same way to African American people, who were gatekept from this wealth. Now, that's not to say that they weren't going through any kind of economic improvement, as they had been since emancipation. By this point, African American people were rapidly diversifying their types of work, shifting through a big majority in agriculture and labour-related jobs to a more spread out, varied mix of labour. But the reality was the political climate was still doing whatever it could to hold African American people back. Segregation was still going strong, heavily splitting the neighbourhoods between white and black people, which ultimately included splitting the wealth of areas too. Even when it had the first marker of its end with the Brown vs. Board of Education in 1954, it still took another decade to dismantle it completely. And this still obviously didn't end people's racism. The reality was white people just find other ways to let their racism flow. And the fact of the matter was, integration was in fact hell. You only have to look at a few stories to get a good idea. In 1959, in a school in Little Rock, Arkansas, the first big test of school integration happened. 9 black students attended the high school. Well, attempted to. The Arkansas governor commanded the National Guard to surround the school and prevent the kids from getting in the school. With some legal action from the NAACP, police escorts were eventually summoned to help the kids get in through a side entrance, almost 3 weeks later. But the white locals grew more and more angry, so the black children were quickly taken home for their safety. 3 years later, we have the story of Ruby Bridges. A 6-year-old child, 6, remember that, was one of the first black children integrated into a school in New Orleans. Her first day of school was met with a mob of outraged white locals who had sprayed racist graffiti on the walls of the school and threw stuff at her as she walked. She had to be escorted by a group of marshals for her safety. And she had all lessons taught to her by herself, as the parents of every child in her class was so racist, they withdrew their children. Now, obviously, the photos I'm showing you are in black and white. And if there's one thing this does to people, it makes them think, oh, this was so long ago, but it wasn't really. Obviously, Ruby is still alive and kicking today. And this reminds me of just how recent this was in the grand scheme of things. Outside of education, protests were commonplace for civil rights. The March on Washington of late 1963 was the biggest civil rights march to happen so far. And it was for equality across all aspects of African American people's lives, including jobs, school, and housing, and ended with the famous I Have a Dream speech. But inside the growing civil rights groups and movements, something was changing. There was a fissure growing in the politics and morals of African American people. And this was shown not only in how they chose to combat the racism of the country, but in how they dressed. The respectability politics from many in the Harlem Renaissance era had continued on, and in some cases, permeated how many conducted themselves when opposing the whole white supremacist system they found themselves born into. And can you blame them? Not only were African American people still birthing a full cultural identity, they were doing it under a regime that would punish them for doing the slightest thing. This dual mentality, wanting to prove white people wrong but also wanting to stay safe, bled through into their politics. Sit-ins, marches, peaceful demonstrations were a very big part of the civil rights movement of the 60s. But you'll also notice that in many of the pictures you see of the icons you know, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Bayard Rustin, they're always dressed impeccably. And that wasn't a coincidence. Ultimately, one of the core intentions of civil rights movements was the improvement public opinion of African American people in America. Because for this school of thought, how would the people of America treat African American people if they didn't respect them? Why would the government want to bestow rights to people they didn't think were even worthy of equality in society? Why would the average white person want to treat their black neighbor with respect when they didn't even, in their eyes, look like they deserved it? That then influenced a lot of how they dressed, because from their POV, who are you more likely to treat equally? A man in a tank top or a man in a tailored 3-piece suit? A woman in her nightie or a woman in a beautiful but modest dress with her hair styled and not one edge out of place? And that's not to say this is the only reason that these folk dress good. Of course, they also did it because what's better than looking in the mirror before you leave and seeing just how much you ate with that fit? And like we touched on before, this was one thing that the country couldn't take away from them completely. Self-expression. It was a big part of the culture then to be wearing your Sunday best in and outside of political movements. When Martin Luther King gave that speech, he looked good. And Claudette Colvin refused to move from the whites only section of the bus. She looked good. Ultimately, this was down to another part of their political movement, but also their reality. Media optics. Angela Davis expressed this really well. Let me read you a quote. All of the movements were very savvy around media, that they were creating images that would tell the story, and the horror and the brutality that was illustrated in such a way. Like when you were brutally beating a man in a suit, when you were brutally beating a young girl in an A-line skirt. The juxtaposition of violence and elegance was very intentional and very powerful. The outfits had to be slick. And going back to Sunday best, it makes you think of church, right? Well, ultimately, church was one of the only third spaces that African American people could go and be safe, be seen, and organize. Civil rights leaders would often then use church as a place to spread their message and organize, and a key part of that message was to dress well. Take a minute and look at these images I show you. Can you tell me what they have in common? Yes, we've been there already. Sunday best. The men are wearing great suits, the women nice dresses and blazers. Their hair is all perfect, whether a well-attended trim or a tidied, monitored hairstyle. But they're all lacking a little something. Can you guess? Where are the afros? And that's where the other side of the civil rights era fashion comes in. In 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, the party brought a new energy to both the civil rights movement and black fashion. The mainstream civil rights movement was focused a lot on gaining greater respect and civil protection from society. The Black Panthers movement focused more on a militant protection of African American people. The movement itself was founded around black nationalism, and as such, its image grew around that. Among its members, there was more of a desire to reclaim a wider culture that was stripped from African American people, that is, a greater connection to their homeland. Of course, they had no knowledge of where they were from genetically, as a country or tribe. So it became a movement to take aspects of cultures from across Africa, which would provoke meaning and pride. Across the members you would see jewelry fashioned like the Ankh, the Egyptian symbol of life, head wraps and dashikis. However, the founders and the younger members tended to be against this, as they saw it as just another exploitation of black people. Thus, their fashion aesthetic formed mainly around the main energy of their party, militarism. The Black Panther Party stood out against other civil rights movements and leaders like Martin Luther King, as they were not against violence. In fact, they viewed it as necessary to protect their people. When daily black people were still being brutally beaten and murdered by white people, by the state, for crimes they were falsely accused of, sometimes for merely existing. Of course they were justified. Their uniform then went on to harness that energy, said to be inspired by the uniform of the French resistance against the Nazis. They wore their now signature black berets, alongside black trousers and a black leather jacket. That look was an outfit that said it all. Don't with me. And it wasn't just a coincidence that the outfit, head to toe, was all black. The colour black was evolving to become a symbol of the new Black is Beautiful movement, rebuking the negative connotations that the racist West had smeared all over the colour. But how better to express that black is beautiful than having the hair that grows from your head on full display in its most natural, unadulterated, careful form? Members of the party were basically always seen with a perfectly picked fro, which I'd argue served as a corner piece of their aesthetic. Not only did it pair really well with the beret tilted to the side as a general look, it also shouted to the masses that respectability was not their game at all. And just like the more suited and booted civil rights leaders, conscious of how they would be shown in the media, members of the Black Party were too. Their look said, mess around and find out. And boy, did some people. But to do their best to prevent state violence, at the very least, make police more scared of continuing it, they began a police patrol program where they would patrol the police from afar. They needed their presence to be known enough that cops would think twice about causing harm to anybody black, but not so much that the police just saw them as an aggravating presence and chose to fight them. Let me just add that this wasn't all that the Black Panthers did during their time. They created numerous programs dedicated to helping the community. Children's breakfast, free shoes for those in need, and so much more. Of course, thanks to the nature of America, especially during the 60s, the Black Panther Party were up against incredibly tough odds. After its peak in the 60s, where it had a cross-country presence, a mix between mismatching politics, government sabotage, and if we're being real, some ego, the party did begin to decline. But during this time, it became crucial in planting and beginning the initial stages of growth of a seed in the psyche of African American people. And that was the thought that respectability politics wasn't the only way to create a fairer country for them to live in, a safer world to raise black kids in. And ultimately, this politics had an overlap with the Sunday best civil rights attitude to fashion as well. And that was to create safety, whether through being perceived as less of a threat, or in fact, more of a threat. They both wanted the same thing. And safety is needed as much as warmth, food and water. But as humans, there's something more to us. Something that the America we have now has built itself on and promised to everyone who comes to work on it. Wealth. Chapter 3. Logomania and high-end collaborations. A couple of decades after the 60s saw a big mixture of growth and setbacks for African American people. Many leaders they looked up to either locally or through the media had been assassinated or incarcerated. Yet the momentum would always keep going through the passing on of the torch and the determination to rebel against the system until things were right. The 80s saw the fruits of the culmination of decades of labour, with one of the most prominent results of this being an increase in representation of black people across professional fields. Several black people were being elected as mayors across various cities, as cabinet members, and also soaring in their roles, shattering the glass ceiling in many industries. In 1989, a man named Douglas Wilder was the first African American in the entire history of the US to be elected governor. Of course, it wasn't all sunshine, roses, and advancements. In 1991, Rodney King was seriously beaten by police during his arrest. The beating so bad he suffered bruises across his body, a broken leg, and was confined to a wheelchair afterwards. Despite the fact that some of the beating was caught on camera after, the officers were acquitted, which led to the 1992 LA riots, which lasted several weeks. On a more social, household level though, representation was feeling brighter. The amount of black-led TV shows was, with iconic programs now airing like Living Single, Moesha, In Living Color, The Steve Harvey Show, and so many more. It was the best time ever for African American people to turn on their TV and see people that live like them, laugh like them, crack jokes like them on their screen. And it wasn't just in show. Black athletes were dominating too, taking over all sorts of sports. And with them, they brought the fashion. As the 70s were moving into the 80s, I don't think anybody realized just how much black Americans were going to influence fashion. From the fastest woman of all time, FloJo, making sure she always competed with a fresh set of acrylics on, to Will Smith playing his part in popularizing dungarees through the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, which were originally just a worker's garment. African American people on TV were influencing the nation by being themselves. Nobody had any idea just how big things would get yet. And then along came hip hop, born in the Bronx in the 70s. What started as a small city sound wasted no time in blowing up to become a massive nationwide craze. As it grew and took shape, it developed a strong current of social commentary, both internal and external. Greats like Public Enemy, Grandmaster Flash, NWA, and so many more. The door opened wider for rapping about social issues to reach the mainstream. Early rapper Royce da 5'9" said of it recently, "Hip-hop was that voice that America couldn't control. It was that voice of the streets that they didn't know what the next line is going to be. And that scared them. Because we spoke our own unapologetic truth. We spoke about environments that were overlooked, that didn't have a voice, that didn't have a say, that didn't have pretty much anything." Hip-hop was booming, one, because many felt what the rappers were feeling. The struggles they rapped about were so many people's struggles. Two, because that fresh new sound was just... Three, because so many of them were, fine as hell. Four, they really were everyday people, and with that, for a time they brought everyday fashion and began to elevate it. But they also brought smarts and intelligence that the mainstream severely underestimated. My favorite example of this is LL Cool J's Gap commercial. What Gap thought was a simple collab, a hot rapper wearing their new clothing to get more people to buy, had another layer to it, partially influenced by how the marketing team had treated him on the phone leading up to shooting the commercial, which wasn't great. He wore a cap from Fubu, or Aspire, a clothing brand that he had an investment in. What the team thought was just a simple, harmless fashion choice was a way for him to get millions of dollars in free advertising. And it worked. Fubu was propelled to star status. And the best part was, they didn't have to pay a dime. And as hip-hop grew, so too did its economic influence. The sheer abundance of creativity of the artists wasn't just in their musical talents. It would extend to their music videos, insanely talented creatives like Hype Williams, helping to bring their futurist ideas to life. And in the videos, a core theme would end up appearing in many. Their displays of their newfound wealth and extravagance, an evolution of their style displayed on screen. The most expensive furs, custom Tims, wigs, and best of all, brand deals. Brands started to realize the absolute influence of the stars, but also the buying power of African American people. And the beauty was, as they bought more, they influenced more. Sneaker culture, denim, Tims, all of it taking on a new lease of life as the black people of the USA innovated and birthed new styles and fits. But there was still kind of was a little gap. The innovation had mostly been around everyday items and clothing. High fashion still remained kind of static, and a true creative was about to notice this and change it, with the help of a small team. Dapper Dan. Now by this point, Dapper Dan was no stranger to the fashion game. He started in the 70s selling stolen items from his boot. But in the early 80s, he opened his own boutique. Most businesses, however, wouldn't do business with him though, because this was the 80s and refusing to sell to someone just because they were black was still rife. What am I saying? It's still rife now. Just in a different form. But because of this, man said, fine, I'll do it myself. He taught himself how to make clothes. It started with furs as they were pretty popular in his local area of Harlem, but he quickly felt like luxury brands weren't doing enough. So he started to create new items with their logos that nobody could get anywhere else. It didn't take long for his screen printed custom designs to take off. And as he styled hip hop artists, LL Cool J, Eric B. and Rakim, Salt and Pepper, names started to take off and catch the eye of the fashion brands. Unfortunately, towards the end of the 80s, he was struck with legal action using logos illegally, and his boutique closed down. A few years later, he was struck out of the limelight, but continued silently designing for those who would have him. But still, he left his mark. This piece is not just being worn by famous hip-hop artists, but other somewhat wealthy people across the country. By this point though, the rest of America could not deny the impact African American people could have on fashion and culture as a whole. But the reality still was though, that many would only acknowledge it when they could profit from it. And even more than that, in the situations where the black people they would work with would not profit from it. You can see it abundantly in LL Cool J's interaction with Gap. Something that really set this era of fashion and culture apart from its predecessors though, was the real raw authenticity. Not to say the 20s or 60s lacked this, but the reality for many of these hip hop artists specifically was their real unadulterated act of being themselves was a crucial part of their success and their influence on fashion. And let's be real, this energy is still gonna continue on to the modern day. Chapter 4. Ain't no trend they won't eat everyone up in. Welcome to 21st century America, the ultimate land of the free, where anything is possible. This past 15 or so years seen so many big changes, and maybe at a glance you might think things were just super great. First African American woman to win Best Director in US drama competition, the first black president in the history of the United States ever in 2009.
First black president and he the one who bombed it.
First black American transgender woman appears on the cover of Time in 2014.
Is blonde hair, blue-eyed, MAGA Republican vote.
First black woman to headline Coachella. The list really goes on. And the reality is, a lot is amazing and a lot seems to be changing. Civil rights protections for African American people have come a long way. But the reality is, that doesn't really change the fact that America is a white supremacist colonial project, and therefore has white supremacist systems still in place. Though it has been illegal for a minute now, studies prove that discrimination in workplaces when it comes to hiring still takes place. And worst of all, police brutality is still alive and well. The only difference before from now is that we have the internet, which can help to some extent in the pursuit of justice against police and other people who do harm black people. There's no greater example of this than the murder of George Floyd at the height of the pandemic. At this point, the world was in various forms of lockdown, which meant that most people were even more connected to their electronic devices than usual, as it was really the only way to engage with the world outside their home. This meant that people who would usually avoid noticing and engaging with the very real reality of police brutality in the US were less able to, which of course, as we now know, led to the murder blowing up online. Scores of protests around the world, and the 4 officers involved, Derek Chauvin, Thomas Lane, Tao, and Jay Kong, facing conviction and jail time. Ultimately, it was the crossroads of the circumstances that surrounded George's murder, and the resulting eyes on the case that resulted in the convictions. Without such pressure, I doubt that they would have all been sent to prison, if any of them. But moving on to fashion, the state of systemic racism against African American people is protested against in how some choose to dress too. Slogans now can just be slapped onto tops, and people also choosing self-love as resistance. Although for the former, things are getting a little out of hand, as some people just use these dark moments for internet clout. But outside of that though, black American fashion seems to have incorporated a beautiful amalgamation of styles and trends of years gone by, often modernized to give it a new lease of life. I will state here the obvious. Someone who hasn't been to the US in over a decade, my view of this is obviously very biased to what I see online, and probably at the end of the day, what makes it to me, which in turn will be influenced by my tastes somewhat. But still, I see so many tastes and styles. I see Pan-Africanist fashion, video vixen vibes, logomania, black dandyism, and more are all booming. This article by Vogue on dandyism at the Met Gala really put it in a really good way. Really put the evolution and the state of the almost like amalgamation of fashion as it is now really well. If the early days of black dandyism were rooted in survival, surviving a world that sought to erase or diminish black people, the later evolution has been about flourishing. It's been about taking that heritage of resistance and transforming it into something creative, innovative, and deeply personal. From the Harlem Renaissance to the Black Power movement to today's fashion runways, black dandyism has adapted with the times, taking on new forms while remaining committed to its core values. Today, black dandyism is alive and well on the catwalk. Brands like Balmain, under Olivier Rousteing, reimagine dandyism with opulent, theatrical designs, celebrating both black identity and historical reclamation. Tom Brown's precise tailoring and subverted silhouettes challenge traditional norms, while Martine Rose merges street culture with high fashion through oversized, bold pieces that embody contemporary black dandyism. And I would argue that that's true of a lot of previous styles that are created by previous generation of African American people. Also, something new that is coming from this past decade is black people be letting their presence in trends and spaces that people have tried to bar them from be known. And that's one thing that I will love social media for, as it's changed the game, giving everyone a chance to find their kin, no matter how niche their aesthetic. African American people will be showing up across all the different fashion aesthetics and be eating down in every single one. Alternative, cottagecore, J fashion. Now obviously I'm not saying y'all weren't present before, because they were, but the scenes would marginalize them to the point that it was really hard to find each other, and that would also just mean that people would leave or not feel as comfortable pursuing an aesthetic because you would be the only one you saw, and also be facing racism and exclusion. And I know that racism is still rife on social media, don't get it twisted, but the way that we can all find each other there now is way better than it was before. Does anyone remember forums? I don't know what age the people watching this is, but I met friends on cosplay forums back in the day. Sorry. Just had to have that segue because forums, just the idea of them cracks me up. That's all I had. That's all I had back in the day. There was no TikTok. Shirley Chisholm, I don't know if I said that right, the first African American woman elected to US Congress, said a quote that still stands. They don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And boy, are you my siblings doing this? Are you my siblings across the sea doing this? In high fashion, so many black designers are and have taken up space. Virgil Abloh, Telfar Clemens, Aurora James, Laquan Smith, Kirby Jean Raymond, Rihanna, and so bloody many more. The worldwide influence is crazy, but it's just so beautiful to see. Regardless for if people are giving credit, we know black American people, your influence on global culture can't be denied. You guys really said there's no limit when it comes to you creating an influence in global culture. And I love it for you. Woo! Thank you so much for everyone for watching this. I really, really hope you enjoyed it. I love creating this. I'm like low-key a fashion girly, and I've obviously grown up seeing a lot of amazing stuff coming from the US, and it's really shaped how I style myself, how I love on myself, and a lot more. But if you did like it and, you know, maybe would like to sit with me as I chat about other stuff, how about you give me a little subscribe? I'll be talking a lot more on things blackity black, from fashion to culture to queerness to history. Nothing is safe from me sticking my nose in and learning and making an essay about it. And make sure to follow my TikTok also, because I post a lot more frequently there, because obviously my videos are like half an hour. But like, I'd love to know your favorite black American fashion moment or like time period, and actually any styles that really influence the way you dress. Yeah, please just let me know in the comments. I am permanently obsessed with What's It Gonna Be? Janet Jackson. That outfit, just that whole video has lived so long in my brain. I can't remember my childhood because I don't know, maybe I smoked too much weed, but I can remember that music video so much and just the general vibe, and I can't live without it. Anyways, until next time, I hope life is kind to you and blesses you abundantly. Bye.